For decades, state and federal officials have tested for toxic chemicals in and around the CTS site. This past July, we came out to the Rice's property to test their springs for ourselves in the same area the EPA had tested back in 1990 and again in '99. Dr. Jeff Wilcox and one of his students came with us to make sure we followed the same protocol used by the EPA. Wilcox has tracked the contamination for years.
You can totally see the groundwater just bubbling up right
He has also worked with the EPA in the past and now incorporates the Rice's contaminated property into his teaching curriculum at UNC Asheville.
Starting last summer, we started collecting samples from inside the spring area and have had samples ranging up to 14,800 parts per billion.
That means the level of TCE was nearly 5,000 times the state limit of 3 parts per billion in water. The last time Wilcox tested the Rice's spring was back in January.
So we're going to sample the freshest sample we can get.
This time he took a sample from the head of their spring, about 60 feet from the CTS site. I took another about 50 feet further downstream. Back at the lab, Wilcox used the EPA's approved method of testing, and within 30 minutes, we had the results.
So the first sample you collected is 735 parts per billion.
That's 245 times the state's regulated limit.
And you're going to see these bubbles.
But the sample Wilcox took was much higher.
At the spring is 5,500 parts per billion.
That's more than 1,800 times the state limit. And remember, we took these water samples 27 years after CTS shut down operations. We wondered if toxic vapors could also be detected in the air. In 2008, the EPA's air testing showed high amounts of TCE around the Rice's property, 16 times the state's acceptable level. In 2009, NC DENR official James Bateson spoke about the issue of toxic vapors around the CTS site during a Buncombe County Commission meeting.
We strategized a lot to try to catch a whiff up there, but it's difficult.
But EPA officials were concerned about the vapor levels. They issued this memo in 2010 after their experts reviewed the 2008 test results. They determined the levels of TCE vapors in the air showed a need for future monitoring if the source is not removed or addressed.
There's been no source removal or mitigation since that memo came out.
Each time we went to the Rice property, we could easily detect a heavy odor of chemicals.
There it is. You smell that?
Yeah.
That's solvent.
So we decided to conduct our own air test.
It's on there tight.
News 13 purchased the same test kit used by the EPA. Dr. Wilcox installed the canister along the Rice's fence line in the same location the EPA tested back in 2008.
There we go.
Within a week, our results were in, and the level of TCE vapors was more than twice the amount the EPA had reported in 2008 in the same location. According to our test, the TCE in the air had risen to a level of 39 times higher than a state's acceptable limit.
And what the second test showed is that there is variability in the concentrations. We've been asking for years for the EPA or NC DENR or whomever to do additional air testing. All of the recommended protocols suggest when you're above the screening level that you do additional testing.
When we told EPA officials about our test results, they were eager to get a copy, so we sent them one. They then sent us this email stating the higher levels of TCE could be related to higher rainfall this year. The email states in part, rain refills the aquifer, which raises the level of the groundwater table. A rise in the groundwater table could result in more TCE and other chemicals flowing out of the ground and into the springs on the Rice's property. TCE and other volatile chemicals evaporate from the springs and are transported into the nearby air. EPA officials say our testing reinforces their commitment to complete vapor intrusion studies for homes located near the Rice's springs. In Wilcox's research, he also studied TCE levels in the trees growing along the Rice's property.
And we've lost probably 20 trees around the spring area that have just died.
By taking core samples from trees, Wilcox has been able to map out how far and in what direction TCE has been spreading through the years in the soil and water. Back in 1990, NUS testing showed TCE had already begun migrating away from the CTS site. Today, TCE continues to flow at high levels here at the Rice's Springs. Their spring is connected to Robinson Creek, which eventually joins up with Cane Creek. All of that water then empties out into the French Broad River. The EPA report from 1991 stated the French Broad could be affected by the contamination at CTS, but EPA officials didn't take action to prevent it. Now, 22 years later, the EPA is still in the testing phase and admits it will be quite a while before there's any real cleanup at the old CTS site.
It'll be several years. The remedial investigation phase process takes a couple of years to get through, and this is a complex site. We've got fractured bedrock. It's pretty complicated.
The EPA knew how complicated it was more than a decade ago. In 2001, they hired Lockheed Martin to drill boring holes under the CTS plant. When they got down 34 feet, they reported finding TCE in the soil at the highest level recorded yet, 830,000 parts per billion. In 2000, the EPA had reported the water table was approximately 50 feet below the ground. So at that time, officials knew TCE was seeping further down into the soil. In 2001, it had reached a depth of 34 feet and only had 16 feet to go before TCE would enter the groundwater. The Lockheed study not only confirmed TCE still remained in the soil and shallow bedrock, but it also warned EPA officials that contaminants would move away from the site once they reached the water table. Now, 12 years after that ominous warning, EPA officials confirm TCE has now entered the groundwater.
It's going to travel with the groundwater until the source is removed.
But despite what scientists say, EPA officials have no plans to remove the soil at the CTS site.
We feel like the contamination has migrated down to the groundwater level, so just excavating soil at this point isn't necessarily the best solution.
Nearby residents felt helpless. If the EPA won't help, then who will?
The fumes were just terrible.
We went straight to lawmakers to see how they felt about the way EPA officials are handling the CTS site.
Based on the evidence that I've seen today, it is very troubling.
Troubling enough that Congressman Mark Meadows is talking about holding people accountable, even if it means possible jail time.
News 13 continues this investigation into buried secrets when we return.